we're going to be talking about internal parasites that can get into your horses and some strategies and how to control some of those. The things that you really want to think about is your horses are always going to have some level of worms. Most common worms are what we call strongylids or roundworms, also known as nematodes. So when you look at the horse industry as a whole, there's a lot of dewormer use. So much so that we tend to overuse things to a certain extent. So common practice is to deworm horses 4 times a year. I've been into some operations where deworming occurs once a month. And then there's some things that we try to manage on the horse side that actually leads to more resistance. So the things that I really want you to think about are how you can manage the worm population that's occurring outside of the horse just as much as what's occurring inside the horse. So, you know, typically if you deworm either 4 times a year, if you deworm 2 times a year, once after the first frost and then once after the first hay cutting, these are 2 common practices. Again, another practice is if you deworm all year long with the same dewormer, that's certainly going to lead to resistance in our internal parasite populations. So the thing is we've got to think about how we can still utilize some of these tools. And one the best tool that you have are dewormers. And so where we're really trying to work towards is this concept of strategic deworming programs. Again, if you're waiting till clinical signs, you're already really behind the ball. So you certainly want to get that animal back to health, but you don't want to allow them to suffer if they're dealing with internal parasites. So when you think about internal parasites, a lot of us think about what's going on inside the horse and the damage it's causing to the horses. Either it's affecting the horse's performance or it's not able to function efficiently. Whether it's in a reproductive cycle or just in a grazing cycle. But where we really need to think about where we can make a lot of impact is the worms outside of the horse. And that's where it brings into just the natural life cycle of a lot of these internal parasites, especially roundworms. So you have a lot of eggs that are deposited from the particular animal through its manure and feces, and it's deposited on the ground. And then the eggs eventually hatch out, and then they go into the larval stage. Sometimes depending on what kind of internal parasites, there's different infective stages. But in general, anything from an L2 to anywhere from an L4 can be considered infective in certain horse populations with certain worms. So it's those 2 populations that are outside of the horse. And when we don't think about that and all we are relying upon are dewormers, then it really leads to a lot of resistance. So today we're not only going to share with you how to think about strategic deworming, but actually how you can monitor your horses to really better implement a strategic deworming program. Because by the time you have an adult worm feeding on your horse, the only tool you have by that time is a dewormer. So it all comes down to how do we detect an internal parasite problem. And one of the best tools out there is a fecal egg count. And we're actually going to show you how we do this today with some microscopes that we have. But in general, it allows you to determine if you maybe have a horse that is a high shedder, a moderate shedder, or a low shedder. We know different individuals, even within the same herd or group, can actually shed different amounts of internal parasite worms. So most of the strategies and practices are, if you want to determine what kind of parasites you have, the first thing you need to do is take that manure sample to your veterinarian, and they can do a fecal egg count and then actually do some more diagnostics to determine what kind of internal parasites you're dealing with. But probably, you know, for the majority of what you're going to be dealing with are roundworms. In certain cases, you can have other kinds of worms. And so fecal egg count is one of the easiest methods to determine how well your deworming program is either working or how much your animals are shedding. It allows us to quantify the reproductive potential, because we have adult worms that are laying eggs, and then we are quantifying those eggs in the manure. This technique is really only utilized for strongylids and roundworms. You can have others that we can look at through this method, also like coccidia, but there's different methods for tapeworms and flukes. But the majority of what your horses are going to be dealing with are roundworms anyway. So what you see here is what we call a modified McMaster slide, and so we can load manure onto this, and it actually allows us to quantify how many eggs per gram of manure. The grids are a certain area that we know that correlate back to eggs per gram, and which then tells you a general estimate of the population burden within that horse. So what we have to think about, though, is are you going to try to control your roundworm population, or are you going to try to eradicate? Some of the first research out there that came out was let's figure out ways to eradicate. Well, we figured out real quickly we can't eradicate a roundworm population. What we want to try to do is control. And when you control things, that means you're not trying to eliminate every worm. You're just trying to manage the worms at a level. So you also have what we consider sensitive worms, so anthelmintic sensitive, meaning they're not resistant to the dewormer, that allows them to interbreed with the resistant worms. So in a control program, we're really trying to manage the population where we still have sensitive worm populations interbreeding with those resistant worms to essentially kind of dilute the resistant genes down a little bit, so we don't have just super populations out there that are resistant to not only one drug but multiple drugs. You don't want to become outnumbered by these resistant worms, because you can easily do that when you're selecting for resistance. So again, our goal is to control, and the only way you can really understand how to control an internal parasite problem is to determine what kind of population you're dealing with, to say, okay, we've got a low fecal egg count. And so individually, you can do this. Your veterinarian certainly can do this. Again, allows you to maybe reduce transmission. So if you have a high susceptible population like young foals, then you certainly need to think about, you want to reduce the transmission for those younger stock. You want to reduce the development of drug resistance. And so if you have high shedders, and that they're just continually shedding high populations of internal parasites, then you need to consider how to manage that animal a little bit differently. And we're going to give you some tools and some strategies to think about on that. And then again, have happy, healthy horses. So if you've got a good frolicking horse out there, it's usually a good thing, whether it's on a performance basis or just for an for a good quality animal health for the horse. So when we think about different dewormers, the horse market actually has some different types of wormers. When we think of these and how we group these, like ivermectin and moxidectin kind of work similarly because they're both macrocyclic lactones. But there's several trade names out there, and there's so many more than this, but these are some common ones that I know that you can go buy at the common farm and ranch supply store. There's oxyfenbendazole. This is one of your what we consider a white paste wormer that you can give orally, and then fenbendazole are common ones. Praziquantel is one that's been out there for a long time. Quest and Quest Plus, Equimax. Sometimes these are mixed in with others. But these are just common dewormers that you can go buy. But the key thing to understand is that you need to rotate out of those chemical classes every now and then, just depending on how often you deworm. So if you look at this and want to deworm in September, you want to maybe use fenbendazole like Safeguard, and then switch to moxidectin, which is Quest. Just Quest alone in March, when you probably have a heavier worm burden. So how do you design a deworming program? You don't want to deworm all your horses every 8 weeks, which is a common practice. It leads to high levels of drug resistance. The biology of the parasites change based on this deworming type of program. different worm demographics from horse to horse are absolutely occurring. So you're not necessarily treating the same level of population across the board. The main thing is that you just want to avoid just deworming every 8 weeks because it can lead to a lot of resistance. So in general, how you design a really effective strategic deworming program is you treat some horses more and others less by identifying those high carriers, moderate carriers, and low carriers. It involves doing a fecal egg count. So, but when you do that fecal egg count is important. So you want to do it when the worm population is active, and so environmental conditions have to be conducive. But certainly, some of the most common times to do a fecal egg count are in early fall, and of course, any time in the spring. Sometimes, especially in the Central Plains and Southern Plains area, we can get really hot, dry summers, and so you may not see a lot of internal parasites at that time. And likewise, if you have a really cold winter, you're not going to find a lot of parasites. Advantages to a strategic program when you identify these high, moderate, and low carriers is that you're going to have fewer drug treatments, which leads to less drug resistance, and then just overall better worm control. So this is a possible deworming plan that has been developed based off of research. And what I mean by research is when they see high levels of resistance reduced by implementing different management strategies and different deworming programs. One of the first things is to treat your animals in September, and then your last treatment is in March. So that takes away that treating every 8 weeks or treating every 2 months type of practice, but you're really trying to get away from developing resistance in those worms. Why we say treat in September? Because you're going to have a natural reduction in the worm population going into late fall, into the winter, but then they're going to always come up and rise in the spring. So you want to certainly get something out there in March. So determining which kind of dewormers are working in your herd or individual horses. Again, September is a great month. Again, usually mid to late September is a little bit better because it can still be a little bit too hot first part of September. But September, you do an egg count, and not just on a couple of individuals, but every animal within your operation or under your control. And you categorize these horses, and through research, we can actually categorize these as either low, moderate, or high carriers, and then in this case, contaminators of both your pasture and other individuals. And so anything that has less than 200 eggs per gram is considered a low carrier. Anything from 200 to 500 is considered a moderate carrier. And then, of course, anything over 500 eggs per gram, again, this is mainly for roundworms, is considered a high carrier animal. So essentially what we know through research, this is some published research that does what we consider a hypothetical distribution of roundworm eggs in a typical horse herd. Most of your animals are going to be low carriers, so you don't need to be over treating them, but they'll still have some low-level worm populations that will actually interbreed with some of your resistant worms that could be out there. So if you were to break this down by herd basis, typical across any management practice is that 50% of the horses within your herd are low carriers, 30% are moderate, and then 20% are high. Of course, any of these numbers can change depending on management and how any kind of other stress that could be occurring in those horses. So high stress horses tend to have more worms, whether it's a depressed immune response or immune system or anything else. They tend to have a higher worm count. So this is not me marketing products. These are different examples of products within these chemical classes. And so what I want to advocate is that with low carriers, you don't really need to be putting the kitchen sink to them necessarily. So in September, again, that's a critical month. You can either treat with Ivomec or Praziquantel type products. So it could be either something like this, like an example here. I'm not promoting these products. These are just examples of products within these chemical classes. You can do Ecomax or Zimectrin. And then in March, you do like a combination product that actually has moxidectin and praziquantel. Because what the research shows, if you treat with similar type products with low carrier animals, we're not selecting for resistance as quickly. Now, when you start moving into moderate contaminators, you're going to increase your treatment frequency. And what this does is that you're going to incorporate what we call a different chemical class, which is what we sometimes call white dewormers, or in this case, oxyfenbendazole. So again, you start off with the same kind of treatment approach in September, but then you add another one in November, which allows you to treat right before a frost event occurs, which actually helps decrease the overall population. And then in March, you treat. So low carriers, you have 2 deworming events. Moderate carriers, you have 3 deworming events. And then you get into high contaminators. Again, this is identifying individual horses, not whole herd treatments. So high contaminators, you need to treat them more often or they're going to be breeding more worms. So you have 4 treatments, and certainly it gives another treatment in when you have the winter time to help you control, so you don't have the pressure of the worm population occurring in the pastures. You have 4 treatment events: September, November, December, and March. Again, I'm avoiding summer because in this area, you'll still have some worm presence, but this is when you'll have some active protocols that you can put in place that actually impact the worm population. So how you want to compare this, strategic versus every 2 months. Again, for your low carrier animals, number of doses, there are only 2. Moderate carriers, 3. High carriers, 4. Whereas if you're treating to the typical every 2 months, you've got your 6 treatment events. And so on a typical herd, 20 doses. So on the grand total of overall doses per year, if you break it down by those percentages, it's only about 54 treatments when you break it up by those low, moderate, and high carriers. But if you do it every 2 months, you're actually, for 20 head of horses, it's 120 different treatments that are occurring for that number of horses when you treat every 2 months. So which can certainly lead to resistance, especially if you're using the same product. Of course, you want to protect some of your younger population, your foals and weanlings. Typical practices start at about 2 months of age, and you want to deworm monthly until they get on a good nutritional plane, and then at about 8 to 12 months, you can start following those low, moderate, and high carrier protocols. But certainly you want to protect this group of your horse population because they're more susceptible to the roundworm infections. The roundworms will cause more harm to those younger foals than into some of your more mature animals that can actually develop some immunity. So in terms of another component to strategic deworming is you've got to think of the environmental control. So what's happening outside? So when you consider moisture, strongylid roundworm transmission occurs mostly exclusively in pastures, very seldomly in stalls and dry lots. Now it can occur if you have pasture paddocks that are attached to stalls. But usually in this area, season-wise, summer is the lowest pasture infectivity time, and then winter is cool enough to promote larval persistence, but not a lot of development. So they're not increasing their populations, but certainly spring and fall are ideal conditions to breed roundworms. So you as a horse owner, this is kind of where we're going to end up just the formal presentation, and we're going to show you some different things about how to do a fecal egg count. Is that first thing, you got to have a manure management program. If you can rotate pastures, that's ideal. Certainly avoid overstocking because if you have a lot of those high carrier animals, they're going to be infecting your pasture at a high rate, especially when you overstock it. Group horses by age. Research shows that when you group horses by age and treat them by that, then on the dewormer side, that you get better results. Sometimes where we put feeders and stuff, you need to think about some other parasite management activities. But anytime you're combining animals and then they can be going out to pasture together, it's going to make them more susceptible to a worm population. With that, that's the end of the formal presentation.
Fantastic. So we'll head over here and talk about some of the equipment that we need. We're going to move the webcam over, right over here.
Okay.
And I know I have a few questions that I was thinking about when you were talking. So what about, Oklahoma with our swings in temperature, where winter never really quite wants to stay being winter, and just like it is living here, where it's warm and then it's cold. What's happening with our worms at that point in time?
So in general, when you think about extreme temperature changes, it can affect the worm population. So we're to the point where they're not necessarily going to start going through a lot of reproductive cycles. But at the same time, if we have about 2 weeks of warm, moist weather, then we could have parasite development, certainly. But if we have, say, for instance, this week, if we have a couple of days where it's 40, then 70, then back to 20, you're not going to have a lot of worm development.
And they're hanging out, cold and steady.
And then there's some that are still in your horse, though,
right,
as well. So especially if you didn't deworm later in the fall season, those certainly survive. And so if you don't, they're going to survive and start shedding when the conditions get right.
Okay. So time of year then for our horse owners to actually do these tests, would you tell them to wait till March? We're in the beginning of February here, so is it a little early right now?
Yeah, I think it's a little early right now, but certainly if it starts warming up, you can start looking at your animals probably in February, late February of so later this month. But if it stays cold, you can kind of put it off. But certainly March, you need to think about start sampling your horses, because in Oklahoma we'll get some good weather for worms.
So if our owners got excited and tested their horses in January, that's probably not really very accurate.
Not very accurate on that, especially identifying if you've got a low carrier, moderate carrier, high carrier. But certainly March and into April, you can identify.
So this is good timing to get everybody ready
Absolutely.
for what we need. So I know I have a lot of producers that have asked me about, can they do this at home as part of their herd health monitoring? So you're going to go through a little bit of what might be needed if you wanted to take a look inside your horse's manure.
Yep. I've also got Kylie Sherrill with us here today. She's the one that does a lot of the fecal processing when we're looking for internal parasites. The main thing you got to think, you've got to be able to quantify the manure. So you need a scale.
Okay.
So you always need, we have a digital scale. You can find scales at Walmart that are really accurate, because all it comes down to is weighing a certain grams that we're looking at. And what we want to think about is to get a certain setup going is that you've got to have certain things in place. So one of the best tools out there is to have these little disposable plastic pipetters, because you don't want to reuse a pipette over and over. Once you use it, because eggs can actually get stuck in even glass pipetters. We can rinse them out several times, but if you get these, use them, throw them away, and it's a good resource. But the other thing is to get you some good plastic cups that are also known as bathtubs.
Okay.
And then the other fancy tool that we use are just wooden sticks.
We'll go like a craft project.
Yep. This is a craft project. So what you're doing is essentially you're using these to kind of break the manure up.
Okay.
But the other thing that's very important is that you get some kind of strainer. These are actually, you can get tea strainers, but these are actually, you can find these at Walmart, and they are essentially keep things from going down in your drain.
Okay.
Everything. But these are typical. You can find them. You don't need anything fancy. You can find these in Walmart as well. This is a typical cooking utensil like that you're straining food.
So is there any size that you have to, like the holes or?
So in general, we don't want really big holes. So they're, again, what we try to find is something a little bit smaller. there's no exact micron or size, but you don't want the ones that have really big squares that you can see. So those are just some typical household things that you need. Now, where you kind of have to get into some of the chemistry of this are the flotation solutions.
Okay.
What this is we use magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salt. And so you can buy Epsom salt at any kind of common store. And what you want to do is get the ratio right. So what you always want to do is about 125 grams of Epsom salt to about 500 milliliters.
Okay.
So the other thing that's important in measuring that out is, again, your scale is important, but also the other thing is some kind of volumetric measuring cup that you can get 500 that has millimeters on it.
Okay.
Because a lot of our common cups out there have half cup, ounces and stuff, but then what you want to do is find something that actually measures something in milliliters.
So they have those at the store. We can grab those.
Yeah. And so those are your essential tools before you get to where you get to the cost, which is the microscope. Microscope, you need a really good microscope because you want one that you can adjust the magnification on. And then the other thing that's helpful, especially for horses, are what we call these McMaster slides. These McMaster slides have grids that you can actually load the manure sample into the top, and again, you slowly load it in and kind of fill up this area. And it allows us to quantify eggs per round. With that, I'm going to start demonstrating the process and how you kind of go through this. Is that okay?
Let's see it, Kyle.
Okay.
Hi guys, so the first step that you can do for everything is you need to be able to get your sample. And if you've got multiple horses, you need to keep up with which sample is which. So the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna get a doggy baggie or a Ziploc baggie and a Sharpie and go and collect your samples. They need to be fresh. You don't have to take it directly from the horse, but if you notice that, okay, it's time to go feed Sal and Sal's gonna drop manure, that's when we wanna get our material. And so we're going to take that back and we're going to keep it cool. We're not going to freeze it because then that's going to start breaking down the eggs, but we're going to keep it cool enough that these guys aren't going to start trying to hatch. And then we're going to bring it back into the house. We're going to keep it separate from our food, all that fun stuff, and then we're going to get going. So another thing that was really nice is plastic gloves. You can get these at Walmart, first aid kit, whatever else, to make sure that we're not getting any of the nasty bacteria or anything else on our hands, on our tables, that kind of fun stuff. We've already mixed up our solution. It's really, really easy. All you're going to do is stir it up, and the Epsom salts are going to come into the water. Like he said, we've got our scale, and what we're going to do is we're going to take our bath cups. We're going to write down who's it from, and we're going to tear out our scale, and we're going to begin to do manure. Now, for this method that we're using today, we're going to take 2 grams of manure, and your scale should be able to weld that out, get it as close as you can without picking out individual grass fibers. Good rule of thumb is to take about the tip of your pinky. That's usually going to give you 2 grams of manure, but be sure that you weigh it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have our sample, we're going to take our solution, and we're going to put 28 milliliters of fluid on it. So that's another reason that it's a good idea to have something that you can measure milliliters in, and also at least 28 milliliters. We're going to take that, we're going to add that up, we're going to mix it up really good and make sure that everything's broke up. Depending on what your horse was doing that day, what he was eating on, the stool may be pretty loose already, it may already have, so we need to make sure that everything's broken up. And then we're going to sit there and wait. And we've got to wait 5 minutes for everything to start coming out of that fecal material and those eggs to start getting infused in the solution and out of all the grass fibers and everything else that he's been eating. So we're just going to kind of sit back, we're going to wait, make sure that you've got time. You need to wait at least 5 minutes. If you wait a little bit longer, it's no problem this step. Then we're going to take our nice little strainers and we're going to put in a second cup that we already have labeled, and we're going to strain all the fluid through there. That's going to take out any of the big chunks, any of the big grass fibers, and leave us with our solution that has our eggs in it. Now, once that happens, we're going to take our nice little handy pipettes, and we're going to go ahead and take the fluid, and we're just going to fill our chambers. Now we need to make sure that there's no air bubbles in these chambers because our eggs like the air. They're gonna float to the top of things. So if there's air bubbles in there and large air bubbles, then our eggs are gonna congregate around those instead of where we need them to be. Then we're gonna set down our slides. We're gonna wait another 5 minutes and then take our slides and go to the microscope. So we've already got some slides made up and we've already got one ready on the microscope. One thing to think about is if you've got a lot of courses to do, you've got an hour before the eggs start flowing out of the gravity. The water starts to evaporate and our eggs will actually float to the bottom instead of staying at the top of the steam.
Good tip. Time management. So Kylie, I have a question before we go over to the scope. So I've done this before and I've used 4 grams with my method in my equations. Is it just a matter of changing your math?
Yes. A lot of times, Bet's just going to go through and he's just going to grab a bunch and add fluid to it. But we're wanting to do a calculation. We're wanting to know whether they're a low carrier, moderate carrier, if they're a high shedder, whatever else. So we're wanting to be as precise as possible so that we're not medicating horses above what they need to be.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to take a look now, right? So the drama, and you have horses, and then did you bring us some other species as well today?
Yeah, so the first one we'll look at is a horse sample, and unfortunately it's the same little critters under there, just different species, but they all look the same at this level. And we should have on the slide 2 strongylid eggs, and these are the guys that we're worried about getting in for horses, especially our younger animals and our older animals. These guys can really wreak some havoc. So when we go through here, what we need to do is get our slide focused, and what you're going to want to focus on is the blue lines on.
All right, we got to share our screen so everybody
Yeah, so
can
let
see
me
this.
get this.
Share, yep. Perfect. So I'll confess, these are mine, but I have to keep horses around so we can do people like on them, right? So, but I'm interested to see what's there.
Okay, so on our lowest setting, what we're trying to do is focus in on the blue line or air bubble. And as you can see, there's already an egg that we can see. So there's already a strongylid egg.
Oh.
So once we get into focus and we feel comfortable with that, we can go down to our next setting. Oh, maybe we don't need to with camera.
No,
We don't
no,
need to with camera. Never mind. When you're doing this at home, go down to your next setting, and you'll see a screen similar to what we have there. And you should be able to see eggs like that. Another thing that you might see, and we'll see it in the goat sample, is coccidia. But
So this is a Strongyle egg then. How can we tell?
so there's a lot of different places out there, and you can search for USDA files that have really good pictures, high quality pictures of these guys. But that's going to be the shape. It's going to be an oval shape. There's not going to be a cap or any extra lines on it. And then internally, you're going to see basically that worm embryo. You're going to see a bunch of cells. If the sample's got left on the counter for a couple hours, you might see these things actually start making structures of the worm. But this is what you're typically going to see is an oval circle with a bunch of dark little circles inside of it.
So they would literally start turning into a worm on your counter.
So that's another fun thing. In
Oh,
our
I
goat
love fun
samples, these are some that we have left over from some cheap samples from the summer, and there's actually one that is larvated where you can see the worm inside the egg. And I was even able to find a worm that had hatched out and died on the slide.
Oh, fun.
So
Do we get to see that tonight?
yeah, we can, no big deal. And what the fun thing with these guys is we're wearing gloves, we're keeping things off of the counter, we're not using little Timmy's toddler stools to set all these out on. But in the egg stage, and then when they're first hatched, they are not endangered humans. That is not their infective stage. You can drink them all day long and you'll never have a problem. However, the longer you let them out, they might actually molt. There's things that have happened in really well-known parasitology labs where they were doing a lot of fecals, they washed their cups out, and there's someone nearly died because they couldn't figure out what he was infected with. And it ended up there was an infective stage larvae in the washroom. Got us coffee cup and he ingested those. So right now, everybody's safe. There's no big thing. We're good. I don't let my tech get my coffee. We're good to go.
Okay. So on this then, if you're, we would be counting these as we go. So tell us a little bit about how that works.
So what you want to do is you want to start in a corner. And on these McMaster slides,
Oh my.
there is chambers. And so you're going to find a corner of those chambers. And you've got 2 sets. So you're going to find that corner. and you're going to slowly start going up. And they may be clustered, they may not.
But they should all be up at the top, right?
Yes, okay, so our little dark circle there, that is an air bubble. So every once in a while, if you find one of those, you can refocus.
Okay.
And just make sure you're on the right plane of field. Go through here, and we've got one chamber, or one line down, and we go over.
What
So
about ones that are on the edge? What do we do?
So the edge of our lines, that's on the outside, that's at the very top of our blue lines. We do not count that. If it's inside the chamber, within our blue lines, and over half of it is out of the blue line, then we can count it. So we don't count that one. We notice he's there, but we don't care about him. And we go through and we keep moving. So like there's another one, we count him. And we're gonna go through line like that through both chambers and we count up. So now we're up to 3, and we keep going over. Now, when I looked at the sample before, there was 24 of these guys in the sample from the source. So there's another. So really, within those first 3 lines, we really didn't see anything. So we're going to do everything on that chamber. We're going to write it down, go over to the other chamber, write it down. Now, when we go to look at parasite loads, we're going to add both of those together and add or times it by 50.
Okay.
So if there's 24 in this set and we times it by 50, that gives us 120. My math is right? It's math. So 124, he's in our low category. If you worm me with one of our lower dose, not really heavy things. And then we go on and we check him again.
Or I should wait till March.
Or you should wait till March and look at him again. That's right. It's still really cold, so our worms aren't going to be active. They're not going to be rising in population.
Very fun.
Did you want to show the goat sample?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not a goat specialist, but I'm sure many of our horse owners out there may have multi-species parks, so I would love to see goats. So it's the same principle though, right? Even if we're talking about a completely different species, we still talk about doing pico-like counts and strategically deworming them?
Yes, so if you've got a little companion goat or anything else, you're going to do the same thing for that guy as you would for your horse. And we're looking for a lot of the same type of worms. So even though it's a totally different species, we're going to see the same thing.
Okay. Why is it yellow? Is that a silly question?
So when you think about different fecal manures, you're going to have horses that are always going to have looser manure than others. You're going to have some that are extremely dry. So this sample, not only were they on finer feed at night, they're given a pretty fine pelleted feed instead of just being out on the grass. So a lot more of that fiber, that plant matter is going to be able to get through. That's the reason if you get started doing this and you just see the sink strainers, they're letting too much material through and it's too dark in this, you don't like doing it. That's when you start getting the finer mesh. You can even use a coffee filter. It just takes longer to kind of get through and look at those samples, and it collects a lot more of those.
Okay.
You see it?
So a goat would have strongyles as well?
Yes.
Yep.
Just goat strongyles?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So like homunculus, like the barbacoa worm, is a strongyle.
So for our horse owners, though, to be clear,
Yep.
they're not sharing the worms. We just call the worms by similar names.
Yes. So roundworms in general, and how we use this method is what we're trying to quantify strongyles.
Perfect.
So you have to focus it to the camera on this one.
I'm super excited to see this.
Yeah.
Now we're getting where it's supposed to be.
So while we're focusing, you said you could see coccidia through this, or is that a different method?
No, same method. Technology will help us out just a little bit. hopefully should be able to see it. They're going to be much smaller than our strongylids. And so a lot of people, until you know what you're looking for, the first couple samples I did, yeah. So that is about the size that the worms are going to hatch out as. So this guy's dead, he's not moving across your screen, but he probably hatched out the last time we had the samples out while they were sitting in the refrigerator or even on the way here.
Really?
So if you see these guys swimming around, okay, place your tables down, but you're not going to become infected with these guys.
But he took his moment.
Yeah, he took his moment. Unfortunately, he's not going to be able to complete the life cycle.
Or fortunately.
Fortunately,
I'm all in favor of him being dead.
We'll go over to this other chamber. We have some. So there's a
If we can't find it.
really
we might-
confusing.
Yeah.
It was in that
Upside down
first
slide.
chamber. So yeah. So we're going through our first chambers, and a lot of times, and there's no rhyme or reason to it, they can be clustered, and so you may go through 3 or 4 lines and see nothing, and then bam, there's 20. When that happens, don't get discouraged or anything else. And just keep counting away and then worry about it in the end. So there's an air bubble. We're going to refocus just a little bit. And we're going to keep going.
Okay.
So if we keep seeing air bubbles and they're still where they're supposed to be, no worries. There's only I may have to go and look at it and bring it back up.
But this is a common method that we can see coccidia as well as other kinds of roundworms that so forth.
So a lot of times you'll even see things like this, and all this is dead, broken worms.
Dead, broken worms.
So you might actually, if you take a fecal sample after you've warmed your horses after a couple of days, you might see bodies of the adult worms that have died off and are exiting through the manure. And you can see root systems depending on what your horse has been eating. There's a lot of fun stuff that can show up on these guys.
That's why you said to look up your guides to figure
Yes,
out what.
and if you search online for McMaster through the USDA, McMaster procedure, it will give a really good guide on how to do this so you kind of remember what's supposed to be happening, as well as even some of the pictures of the coccidia and strongyle eggs, but it's going to be for goats and sheep. So you can look and you can find pictures of the horse parasites as well.
But for our horse people, coccidia, don't bother looking for it.
So I mean, coccidia can be a problem, but it's certainly not. You're not trying to identify high, low, or moderate carriers. Coccidia is again, you want to treat that as it can almost self-limit itself, but it can also cause a lot of problems in certain horses, especially if you don't have a good manure management program. If you've got a lot of manure staying around where the horses are hanging around, then you certainly can have a coccidia issue. Yeah, we may not find coccidia on this one, so
There's only 2.
yeah.
So excited to see a coccidia.
Do you have any questions or?
I'm checking in with our audience, so if anybody has questions at this point in time, we would love for you guys to text them or put them in the chat box while Dr. Talley's still here. While Kylie's looking for a coccidia.
Right. So I'm
Let
gonna,
me check if we have some questions. But certainly would like to remind everybody that this is our monthly webinar series. And next month, we'll actually have Dr. Candace Lyman, and we're going to be talking about doing breeding soundness exams in mares. So Dr. Talley, if they have any other questions after this, we can put them in contact with OSU Extension and all of our various publications and information.
Exactly. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.